Thank you for joining us for this live CNBC Africa debate coming to you from the Cape Town Convention Centre, where the Boston Consulting Group BCG Global Partners Conference is currently in session. A short while ago, BCG released a report identifying the 4 priorities required for leadership, or the 4 priorities requiring leadership for South Africa's future. Over the next hour, we identify these priorities and examine them in detail. Joining me to do that, to my immediate right, I am joined by Mr. Adam Ikdal, who is the Senior Partner, Boston Consulting Group South Africa, and author of the report. I'm also joined by Minister Derek Hanekom, who is the South African Minister of Tourism. To his immediate right, Mr. Cas Coovadia, Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa, and of course Dr. Reuel Khoza, who is a South African businessman and former non-executive chairman of the Nedbank Group. Thank you all for joining me. Adam, if we can just start for a little context around the report, and perhaps you can give us that context, being the author.
Yes, thank you, Bronwyn. In terms of the methodology, we used 3 different sources in the report. We have, in BCG, we have our own proprietary tool that we call Sustainable Economic Development Assessment, SEDA. It's a great tool because it allows you the opportunity to compare different countries across 10 different dimensions, like GDP, education, infrastructure, etc. Secondly, we have discussed and interviewed key stakeholders from all sectors in South Africa, had in-depth interviews. And in our daily work in BCG, we of course speak every day with executives and CEOs across South Africa and Africa. The findings that we have are 3, so let me just quickly take you through the 3 findings. Number 1, South Africa is very, very poor actually in terms of converting what we call wealth into well-being. In the SEDA report, we compare 149 countries, and out of those 149, South Africa actually ranks 138, so fairly poor performance. Even if you cut it across different peer groups in Sub-Sahara, we still come out quite poorly actually. Secondly, there are 4 areas where South Africa is lagging significantly behind. It's around education, unemployment, income equality, and health. Across those 4 areas, we see significant challenges, in particular on the area of education, which we believe is potentially the root cause for all the challenges that South Africa face, short-term and long-term. And finally, the 3rd finding, which was a little bit surprising to us actually, is the notion of lack of leadership. So we see that you need 2 things: aspiration, where do we want to go, and secondly, power of execution towards those ambitions. And we do see that leadership is a challenge, and I'm not talking only about government, even though, of course, government has to set the tone and the pace of the discussion, but we do see we need leadership also in terms of labor unions, which play a critical role in the country. Private companies have to contribute, and also civil society. So even, me and you, towards our families and children, need to play an important role. So that was actually the most resounding, I think, feedback we got from all the different sources, that if South Africa is going to succeed, we need real leadership, less focus on cutting the pie, more focus on growing the pie.
Let's focus on education for a moment, because you highlight it as the number 1 priority. That's correct, the number 1 priority. Minister, if you could come in here, do you believe that education is central to South Africa's future success, that is the overriding silver bullet for the economy?
If you want a short answer, yes.
You can elaborate a little more than that.
Well, clearly it's critically important, and perhaps one of the policy challenges and institutional challenges that we've grappled with and seriously grappled with for the last 20 years, because probably the legacy of decades of apartheid rule had a greater impact on education than any other sector or any other area or endeavor of government programs, if you like. And so we were dealing with very, very serious backlogs, very serious challenges. These challenges are being systematically addressed, but there's no doubt about it that we would have liked to have seen far more progress than we have. I don't think we should try to pretend otherwise, that the results are not what we would like to have, but we also, on the more positive side, we saw the matric results, that's the grade 12 results last year, and there was significant improvement on the previous years. And so we're seeing a slight sort of upward trend, if you like. That's very important. I think it's good that not only in the area of education, but all other areas, that we have a framework called a National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan talks about how these different endeavors talk to each other, how they impact on each other, but sets targets for education, for example, and more than just targets, but the things that need to be done in order to achieve those targets. And I think we're systematically putting the pieces in place that will lead to significantly improved education results. It's not only education, it's post-school education, skills development and training. These are big deficits we have in our country. We have to acknowledge it and to say if we're going to go beyond the current very sort of sluggish economic growth, if you like, the 2% that we have currently, it's going to depend largely on our human capital base and the extent to which we invest in that.
Minister, you mentioned the National Development Plan, and I think everybody acknowledges it's great to have the vision and the strategy. It really comes down to the execution. We're going to chat about the NDP a little later. Cas, an interesting stat I picked up in the report is that South Africa actually spends more in terms of per capita on education than most of its peer group. So money is not the problem. Does it come back to what Adam highlighted earlier, and that's leadership?
Yeah, money is definitely not the problem. And I agree. I think it's leadership across the board. It's not just government. I think government does need to take the lead in creating an environment and a framework of certainty in the country and of governing. But I think that there are challenges in different sectors of society. I agree education is the number one issue. But I also don't think that we are working with each other as different stratas of society to, one, at least reach agreement on what sort of economy we want, and then make the links between education and that economy and how we actually develop people to be employed in the economy that we want and in the economy that we're interacting with other countries on the globe. So I think that it's education across the board. It's also developing a culture that says that you don't just have to be at university for education, the development of technical skills, the development of people that are needed in different parts of the economy. And I think what was very important in the report is that we need to change our mindset on education. I think that the importance of education, I think, has been eroded in our society, and for various reasons. And I do think that the relationship between government and other sectors of society and the union movement, particularly in South Africa, is one of those. We are not putting the sort of significance on education and on educators that we should be. And I definitely agree with that finding in the report.
Reuel, I picked up another interesting stat, and that was if you look at Germany, they offer up students at the age of 16 the choice of either pursuing vocational training or remaining in the mainstream schooling. And from that instance, they in 1 year, and it was from 2004 to 2005, managed to reduce unemployment in the country from some 15.6% to 7.2% by offering up that vocational training. Really what that gave the students the opportunity to do was to spend 1 day in the mainstream education space and 3 to 4 days in the internships, in the practical application. Silver bullet.
Yeah, I think you're very right about opening up vocational training as a stream that people should be encouraged to follow, and making it desirable. All too often, people tend to believe that anything that is other than white collar is not the thing to pursue. And where we are concerned as a political economy, as a state, I think one of the biggest problems that we have is that curricula tends to be developed in limbo. We should actually start with the end in mind. Anyone who wishes to develop a curriculum should actually first understand the world of work and work backwards to the requirements where the students are concerned. There is no question about the mismatch between the world of work and the students that actually qualify, even as engineers, even as chartered accountants, that they actually are not prepared with a custom-made curriculum that is meant to address the needs of the economy, the needs of the public sector. Germany is one example that one could actually really follow. There are a number of other countries in the East that actually do the same thing. They plan, from wall to wall, cover every aspect, and prepare people sort of fit for purpose by the time they actually finish their education, covering the need for those that actually work with their hands, those that are going to work for the industry, for the agricultural sector, because food security is so important. But all too often, if you speak to many students and talk about agriculture, they take it, it's menial job. It is not the kind of work that they should actually prepare themselves for, which is why, in fact, as it is now, we are found wanting, even where food security is concerned. So the idea should be to do a thorough analysis of the needs of the country, and then let that resonate with the kind of training, comprehensive training and education that we prepare our youth for.
Minister, couldn't we see with immediate effect aggressive incentives for business to offer up internships, vocational training?
I couldn't agree more. If we're going to shift, firstly, ensure that you improve basic education. And so starting from a very early age, a lot of that is happening. And improve the infrastructure and the facilities that facilitate good learning and teaching. A lot of that is happening. But you're absolutely right. The transition, you can offer the training and you can offer the university courses, etc. But transition from there to entering the world of work and being equipped to enter the world of work. So firstly, more needs to be done at that level on the soft skills development, for example, to ensure that people are equipped with the kinds of skills that a modern economy needs. But then secondly, you're quite right. I think we've recognized that. I think you will see in the next couple of years a significant increase in the numbers of internships offered.
We may not have a couple of years. It would be great if we could see it in the next 6 months or so.
Okay, tomorrow.
Thank you.
When you wake up tomorrow. But the fact of the matter is, when you're a country in transition and you're introducing new measures and you want the private sector to take up those measures, it doesn't happen instantaneously. The fact of the matter is we've got to be driven by a common vision. And it's not just government, but it's government, private sector, academia. So we can say this is where we're going. The National Development Plan did assist enormously in putting us on a sort of a joint, collectively agreed on route or road. But again, back to the internships. There will be, and already is part of the thinking, that internships are critically important to give people that workplace experience. Because the large numbers of unemployed people that we have at the moment, the worst part of it is not only the numbers of young people, but that's a global phenomenon, but the numbers of people that have been unemployed for 10 years that have never spent a day in a workplace. So just simply creating that opportunity is empowering, and our experience of the internships that have been done, and there are significant numbers, is that there's a high level of uptake once completing the internship. So it's just one. I could speak about others, but I think we're under time constraints.
Adam, you wanted to come in here?
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to see, if you look at the root cause analysis in terms of what makes one school great and another school not so good. The answer is actually teacher quality, or the lack of teacher quality. Let's take a statistic. If you give a math test to a teacher between grade 1 and 6, 60% will fail that test, and it's the same test that they give to their own students in math, just as an example of teacher quality. This also goes back to labor union versus government as well. One of the problems on teacher quality is, of course, that the labor unions are not interested in real accountability, real performance management in terms of doing that. And what we see, a good school versus a poorer school, is that the enthusiasm and passion from the principal at that school is the determinator. It's not about buying more books. It's not about getting better, real estate. It's all about the passion and accountability, performance management from the principal on the different teachers.
And as you mentioned, the unions playing a huge part in stumbling the process, if I can use that in elegant English. But effectively, as you say, you're not allowed to conduct performance management sessions with teachers, neither are you allowed to have them attend training after hours. I think in consulting, it's a widespread term or well-known term that if you cannot monitor something, you cannot manage it. If you cannot monitor something, you cannot measure it. So we need to get consensus here on labor, business, and government to fast-track that process. Cas, you mentioned something very interesting, and that was the mindset change. I spent some time in Nigeria last year, and on that stage, they're also focusing on education. What is well known in that space is that if you can't, in terms of a skill set, if you can't, you teach. If you can't, you teach. That's the mindset in Nigeria, and I think perhaps across the African continent. We need to elevate the status of teachers in society.
No, we do. And you know, listening to you, you made the point that you're not allowed to performance manage teachers. You're not allowed to do this. Well, allowed by who? And we're talking about leadership here. I think absolutely, let me put business on the table first. I think business doesn't have a sufficiently long-term mindset. I think that we need to begin to talk about what interventions we need to make with government and others now so that we're doing business in 20 years' time. I mean, that's a critical question. And so it's not business as usual. And I think business has a lot of introspection to do there as well. But government has a mandate to govern, okay? And it's not a question of whether, in this case, a union allows you to implement the correct decisions that should be correct in the national interest. You've got to consult, you've got to take into account people's views, and then you've got to make decisions and implement them. And you've got to implement them within the context of a national interest agenda. And whether it's a union or whether it's a business grouping also that complains and after that, you manage that. But we cannot have a situation in our country where you consult, you take those into account, you arrive at a decision, and then you are unable to implement that decision because of certain factors. So I think that sort of strong government and governance is needed. And within the context of that, we should all be working. So you know, there's a group in South Africa called Harambee that I work with, which actually takes matriculants and trains them for work and then places them in organizations. Nedbank, I know, is a big and has a lot of take-up on that. And their experience is that if you actually use the right methodology to train pupils for the workplace in consultation and in close cooperation with the business that you're training for, all my members that are using Harambee tell me that the pupils that have been through there are more consistent, are more efficient, are good for the workplace. So it can be done. But there's got to be collaboration between business and government on this, as Reuel says. We've got, the concentration has got to be to educate and train people for the economy. That's how we take care of unemployment, that's how we take care of growth, and that's how we take care of inequality and other.
Cas, you make the point, and I think we're going to make it over and over again today, that it's key collaborative leadership across business, government, and of course civil society as well, and labor coming into play. Reuel, how do we fast-track that? Because we don't want to keep discussing it. We don't want to be sitting on this stage in 2 years' time still discussing how we achieve that collaborative leadership. Let's fast-track. What can we do to do that?
I think from the business sector, we should stop expecting government to actually call us to meet and collaborate. We should take the initiative ourselves. Civil society should also call on those that they have put into leadership positions to book and ask them to be accountable. It is not something that should actually emanate from just one source called government. The PPP conceptually would actually optimize our output, but how many of us actually call those that are in government leadership to book and even render themselves available for cooperation and deliberation? I believe the various formations in the private sector should actually find ways of coalescing and approaching government. And I would like to plead with government also to be responsive. I don't think it helps us to manage ourselves through ad hocracy. You know, do this little thing and go away. attend a session, a breakfast session addressed by one or other minister and take its job done. It should actually be built into our DNA and our mode of doing things. Collaboration should be the course to follow. The minister has referred to the NDP. It's a fantastic plan on paper. But I would take issue with a few aspects of it. One, even in his definition of what the national interest is, what the national vision should be. I mean, you actually have to read 4 pages to understand the vision. That, to me, is actually carving a scenario as opposed to giving a vision. The vision should actually be stated, very, very briefly. It should be something that one should be able to relate to without having to plow through a number of pages. The best of leadership, the world over, is actually vision beckoned and values predicated. And all of that you can state in a very, very brief note, as opposed to 400 pages. The 400 pages we can read because we're academically inclined, but I think even that has got to be summarized and rendered a lot more malleable in a short paper that actually...
Well, there's a good starting point. I know Minister wanted to respond, but before you do so, I want to ask you, Reuel making the point that business needs to reach out to government. Are you getting phone calls from the private sector, sir?
Oh, occasionally. No, every day I get letters and phone calls, and I have frequent meetings with the private sector. So I think it's a somewhat, we don't want to generalize. I mean, we're in a country, by the way, where free and fair debate and vigorous debate is not only permitted, it's encouraged, and it happens. The very fact that we're getting a sort of a critical voice in the National Development Plan, it is a long-term vision that every party in Parliament supported, which is good news.
But you do agree we could take it from 400 to 10 pages?
But you know, there are many summaries of the National Development Plan, but there is a comprehensive National Development Plan which will stand, which goes into some kind of detail, because you know, you put too little detail, they say, well, you're just making this as a wish list. To make it happen, you've got to say, what is it exactly that you want to do in the various areas? So it has to be a longer document if it's going to be a meaningful document, but for the ordinary member of the public, quite correct. But let me get on to the question that you put to me. It's an uneven story. I can say in the area of tourism, it's essentially, the success of tourism is quintessentially about the relationship and partnership between government and the private sector. It's done at the private sector level. You're sitting at this marvelous convention center, you're staying at various hotels in Cape Town, and I'm sure you're having a great stay. But I meet with those hotel group owners, I meet with the CEO of the waterfront, and I'm open to meeting with them any day of the week, any evening of the week, and so it happens. So it's an uneven story. So to say that the government is not responsive or that the partnership is not as strong as it should be, it's correct, because it can never be too strong. But in many sectors, the relationship between government and the person in office and the industry leaders is actually very, very strong.
Another key priority identified by the report as requiring leadership is unemployment. We're sitting at 25% stubborn unemployment rate in South Africa. Our peer group, 7 to 13% unemployment. Let's get your thoughts before we dive a little deeper into unemployment. And obviously that is linked directly to education. If you don't have the skills, even if you have the jobs, you can't marry the two.
Exactly. And it's one of the... Of course, one of the big challenges of South Africa is 25% unemployment. Let's say of the 52 million living in South Africa, around 15 million are employed. The National Development Plan calls for an additional 9 million jobs to be created until 2030. And with a sluggish economy growing by 2%, that's not going to happen any day soon, with all due respect,
I agree.
ministers.
As it stands now, yes.
Yeah. And we also know that the larger corporations are facing very tough external environments. Most of them are actually shedding jobs, not adding jobs. So I think rather than saying how many people can we get employed, it's also a matter of how can we create new companies that will flourish in the economy. And if you look at the environment for, let's say, small, medium-sized micro businesses today, it's an environment where it's very difficult for a young entrepreneur in South Africa today to kind of make it. It's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape to go through. And also on the perception side, other countries, they celebrate their successes and celebrate their entrepreneurs. I heard a quote the other day that in other countries you roll out the red carpet. In South Africa, you roll out the red tape. So we have to, and you have, and you have actually great examples of fantastic entrepreneurs. You know, Elon Musk of Tesla. You have Adrian at Discovery. So you have great entrepreneurs in the country. But rather than having them on the front page, you know, inspiring the young entrepreneurs, they're kind of seen as, you know, business is intrinsically seen as a little bit challenging in this country. So we have to celebrate the role models, we have to build the new companies, we have to celebrate entrepreneurs, and also reduce hierarchy, because we have to create jobs also in the small and medium-sized area.
Labor efficiency, according to the World Economic Forum, we come in at 113 versus 144 in the total survey. A lot of that has to do with the labor flexibility, the rules and regulations that Adam is referring to. Again, Reuel, this is something that we discuss over and over again. Can't we see some short-term wins here and relaxation of regulations so that when you hire somebody, it's not as though you're putting a noose around your neck?
I think there's a great deal that, can you hear me? Yes. There's a great deal that could be done in that area. Adam has made reference to the red tape. It's actually quite debilitating. And there's a great deal that we can learn from other economies, your Singapore, for instance, your Malaysia, about the turnaround time. Apart from banking, I actually am a small-scale entrepreneur who would like to develop certain industries, who would like to actually turn fallow potential into reality, like, you know, building commercial centers in the peri-urban areas. You apply to have that. In Singapore, the turnaround time will be about 48 hours if you're lucky, and if you're unlucky, perhaps it will be a week. In South Africa, it can take you up to 3 years, it can take you up to 5 years. Even where you want to build a school in collaboration with government, there is one high school that is now functioning, but it took me 6-7 years just to get the green light. So let the bureaucracy be cut. Let there be a center that you can go to and say, well, this is what I would like to do, and they should be able to tell you inside a week whether or not it's permissible, so you can get on with other alternatives. Bureaucracy in South Africa actually kills.
Minister, let the bureaucracy be cut, sir.
Yeah, but fine. We'll cut it tomorrow. I think more importantly, if we're sort of examining the problem and analyzing the problem, we have to do it quite thoroughly and say, well, you know, one has to find the right balance between necessary regulation, necessary processes, streamline those processes. For example, if we said like deregulation, one thing is, since 1994, there have been a number of areas of very significant deregulation. I was once upon a time Minister of Agriculture. I can tell you horror stories about what we had to undo in agriculture at that time after 1994. We have a banking sector which is quite regulated. It stood us in good stead. When banks were collapsing all over the world, we were not. And so our banking sector is fundamentally strong. Cas can tell you more about that. It doesn't mean that every regulation is necessarily according to the wishes of the banking sector or the wishes of the consumer, but regulations are about a few things. Protecting consumers, protecting your environment. So even in the case of the school, we have in our country, we don't have chaotic development, far too slow, yes. But the need to go through environmental impact assessments, good. Because it's, you know, the worst part or the worst scenario would be, here we are, let's just get on with it, let's do it tomorrow, but let's do it in a chaotic fashion. In 10 years from now, we will regret it. So yes, the regulations are arguably over-regulation, arguably too much red tape, but certainly it's taking too long. So even when the measures are necessary, I think we need to work on expediting them, making them more efficient. It simply takes too long to get an environmental impact assessment through, but we shouldn't say there shouldn't be a need for environmental impact assessment. Can I just say one little thing on labor and labor flexibility? We've got to understand, and I'm speaking to this audience, where we were 20 years ago, where in fact we had a country where people just had no rights whatsoever. There were no labor rights, there was abuse of labor, abuse of working people, and so we went through a difficult transition. The good news story about South Africa, despite all of these challenges that I identified, is that it is a fundamentally stable democracy where we have to hold things together. One of the biggest challenges of government is to hold people together, many of whom are angry, many of whom are saying, but we were denied these rights before, today we will assert our rights. And so we've got to manage that process, and we are doing that successfully, I would like to put to this meeting.
I agree. Welcome back. We're discussing the 4 priorities requiring leadership for South Africa's future, and we're going to go straight into the third highlight issue, that of course being income inequality, as you set out in the early stages of this discussion. Again, Adam, I'm coming to you for context.
Yes, if you look at income inequality, South Africa ranks second to last globally. Only Haiti have a more unequal distribution of wealth. So it's definitely a character trait of the country. Of the 52 million that live in South Africa, around 60% or 30 million are what we call marginalized, which means that they have to get on by a little over $600 a year, which is not a lot in this environment. So you have a lot of people depending on it. You also have 17 million people living on welfare. The problem being that welfare is not always seen as a temporary state you go through until you get employment or you get by. It's for many people seen as a perpetual way of revenue or income. So as we point out in the report, we think that we need to look into maybe also giving welfare on contingent basis, driving the behavior we want. For example, taking education or going to health checkups. So income inequality is definitely one of the major issues that we have defined in the report.
Minister, before we went to the break, you set out correctly the situation that you grapple with as government on a daily basis, and that is our past and where we are going. So obviously from apartheid to a multiracial democracy, that transition is 20 years down the line, but the legacy is still there, and it runs deep within the country. So your response on this income inequality and the fact that we obviously need to continue wealth redistribution.
Yeah, but if you were to summarize our challenges, if you like, and you can unpack it and talk about the education challenges, infrastructure challenges, health, and so forth. But the 3 big ones that stand out would be persistent poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And they're kind of linked to each other. If we successfully create more jobs, then there'll be less people on social grants. It will reduce the equality gap, if you like. So I think our biggest single challenge lies in the creation of jobs. Economic growth translating into job creation. But it's not unusual, Bronwyn, for countries that are on a growth path, including China, for example, very impressive growth path for a number of years. Inequality has deteriorated in the process, but the poorest are less poor. And in South Africa, arguably, the poorest are also less poor. But the inequality, we have not succeeded in reducing or bringing down that inequality, that huge inequality between the highest income earners and the lowest income earners. And obviously, right at the bottom of the pile are the people with no incomes. If there were not the 17 million social grants, we would have been in serious trouble, or the poorest in society would have been in very serious trouble. But it is also true, it's that policy dilemma that you have all of the time, is to say you've got to do whatever you can do in order to alleviate the most extreme poverty in society and to ensure that people at least have some of their basic needs met. And the only way you can do it in the short term would be through social grants. And taking that and the potential that social grants have that undesired effect of saying, well, actually, it's not worth my while going out there and seeking employment because I'd rather spend my time just collecting that social grant, etc., or even doing informal sector kind of trading or economic activity, because I do get my 1,000 rand a month, and so if I were to sell tomatoes or to do a little bit of panel beating on the side, it will only bring me in 500 rand a month. It's not worth my while. I'll just queue up for my grant instead. It's a dilemma, and there isn't an easy answer to that. But I just want to say again in a nutshell. we must bring our economy onto a higher growth path. That's quite clear. And that has to translate into more jobs. Partly the state has to play a role in it. I do not believe that the private sector is sufficiently in the party. I don't think that there's enough drive in the private sector to say, employ as many people as you can. Incentives have been in discussion with the private sector. Tax incentives for additional employment have been introduced. But I don't think quite the private sector has changed its mindset to say, this is a common problem. If we collectively, all the thousands of small businesses and larger businesses, employ 1 or 2 additional people each, that unemployment problem will be significantly addressed.
Reuel, do you think that the private sector is not pulling their weight?
I think the minister is right. There is no real concerted effort to tackle the issue of unemployment. There's also no real concerted effort to address the issue of where we are placed in terms of Gini coefficient. We're not engaging in sufficient debate. There is an expression in the, which is very popular amongst Africans, lift as you rise. All of those who are able to rise should, in the process of rising, actually lift. More often than not, those amongst us who are somewhat able don't do that sufficiently. So the minister, I think, is right in saying that as a business sector, we have not been coming to the party. But I would like to comment a little bit on the social grants and housing. There is a sense in which I believe anybody who is housed is demeaned. I would suggest that where housing is concerned, perhaps we pick a leaf out of what America does with providing shelter for habitat for humankind. Involve the people who are in fact going to stay in the houses that you enable them to build. Housing is demeaning. In fact, I would hate to be housed, but I would actually welcome somebody enabling me to build a house. So people should actually be involved in the process, participate even in the building of the house, as it were. That way they'll take pride in what it is that actually they dwell in and not pass it on as a rental income source.
You've sparked reactions across the board. I've got acknowledgement from Adam. Cas also wants to come in. Adam, you can weigh in first, and then Cas responds to what Reuel is saying.
Yeah, actually, a quick response to the minister. I'm not sure the answer is for private sector to just keep on employing. That would be fine if you lived in a fishbowl or in a vacuum. Sadly, we live in an open economy, and even increasingly more open economy. So I think rather than appealing to private sector to apply more people, I think South Africa should look at where do we really have comparative advantages. Sure. And being, the Minister of Travel and Tourism, a great example of an area which has really grown fast the last years, and of course natural resources as well. But we do have to look at, other sectors, more service-oriented sectors, high-skill sectors, where also South Africa can play a role. We have the best digital infrastructure on the continent, as an example. How can we apply that? So I don't think the answer is to have a common appeal to all companies, to grow, because if you do that, you lose competitiveness, and you'll probably go bankrupt at some point in time, and then all people will be out of a job. So I think rather than that, let's focus on where are we good, and South Africa has a lot of strengths to build on. And it's a young democracy, and and I think we can do it if we just put our heads to it. So.
Comes back to collaborative leadership, labor, business, government. Cas.
Yeah, I think the whole inequality issue is the one issue where all of these things feed into. Okay, now I think that business needs to look at the structure of our economy. I don't think the structure of our economy is conducive to SME growth. The red tape I agree with, absolutely, and we need to deal with that. But I think there's also a mindset in business, and we need to actually restructure our economy to enable and to actually promote small, medium enterprise growth, okay? I also think that we have, for whatever reason and however we've done it, we've created a culture of dependency. It's changing, but there was a time when a minister of housing said, we want to concentrate on actually enabling people to build their own homes. We moved away from that to actually give people homes, okay? Wrong. And we must say it was wrong. Okay, we need to rebuild the culture of actually allowing people to get their dignity back. Essentially, that's what it is. So I think that we should be talking about the full spectrum between minimum wages and executive remuneration. None of that is sustainable. And to have an inclusive economy, we need to start talking about all of those things. And also, it's not just appealing to business to create jobs or to employ people. It's also to understand what creates employment. So most people who are getting jobs get it through networks. Okay, now something like the youth wage subsidy, which we delayed for so long, with all due respect, in my view, government said we're doing this. Okay? Get people in. Even if you're paying them a lower wage, get them into the system. From there, they build their networks and they grow. Now, we've got to look at our labor situation and labor regulation within the context of these challenges that we have. And nobody is promoting sweatshops or promoting that we should not have labor rights. Absolutely, we should have that. But that should not actually stop us from creating jobs.
I think what we're realizing here is that everything is interlinked. So education goes into the job creation, goes into the income inequality alleviation. There's a fourth pillar, which we need to touch on before we go to our audience, and that is health.
Yes, health. I have to say this is actually one of the more positive stories also in South Africa, even though you have 20% prevalence of HIV among the adult population, which is, of course, a very high number regardless. If you look at the new incidence of HIV, it has reduced by more than 50% the last 10 years. So we're definitely doing something right. At the same time also, if you see child mortality, it's still fairly high relative to peers, but also there we are gaining traction. So yes, health, I think, is a real issue, but I think that's actually one of the success stories also if you look at it in historical terms. But still, I do think that if you look at other countries that have come further, there's something in the narrative and the rhetoric in terms of how you communicate about some of our key challenges. So rather than putting it under the carpet, as you would say, it's also important to highlight it and the importance. So it also goes back to education and information at a very early stage. So everything is interlinked, but definitely health is one of the four
Minister,
areas.
do you agree that we're making positive inroads where health is concerned?
I mean, could you possibly conceive of me disagreeing on that one?
I thought I'd be really easy on you. That was a positive hospital pass.
Right. Rhetorical question, yes, of course. But I think let's try and have an honest debate and to say, well, we remain with challenges. And what I liked from each of these inputs is that it's a balanced picture. We can't sweep these problems under the carpet. But health is an area where we can say, yes, positive achievement, but we can also honestly admit that there were some serious, within our term of office, or rather the period of, let me put it this way, ANC rule since 1994, we've made very big mistakes. And it's no use trying to pretend that we didn't. But the story right now is a very positive story. We have by far the biggest antiretroviral rollout in the world. And the reason for reduced infection rates, and of course one of the significant factors contributing to increasing life expectancy, is the HIV/AIDS intervention. And the interventions are really on two fronts. One is the antiretroviral rollout, and the other one is for example, circumcision. But what you've got is it's driven in society. It's driven by a Minister of Health and a number of players around the country. Say, look, this is going to destroy us. We're going to tackle this. We're going to defeat it. There are two problems in health. One is the communicable diseases, and I'm not a doctor, by the way, communicable diseases and the non-communicable diseases. And so we have another very big challenge with tuberculosis. This is a country that is doing excellent medical research, and I think that's another area we can pride ourselves on our scientific achievement and our research achievement. But a lot of the research is geared towards finding finding solutions to problems we have in our country and global problems, and making a contribution.
If I could please turn to the audience now. Any questions? Mr. Lesser, if we could deploy a roving mic. Thank you.
First, thank you all for joining us here at our Worldwide Partner Meeting. And Minister, I'd just like to pick up on your point with nearly 1,000 partners coming to Cape Town. The experiences here have been remarkable, and as a base to explore the rest of South Africa and Africa, I think it's really amazing here, and it's a great achievement in terms of how you make this accessible to people from around the world. I'd like to come back to a topic that I think is very relevant for what we've been discussing, which is we haven't discussed technology much, and yet we see in many parts of the world leveraging technology in education, the way Kenya is one of the leading edge examples, in employment systems and creating more robust employment systems and worker training systems, as we see in different countries, and in addressing education more generally can be quite relevant in health. Can you comment on the role of technology as you see it playing out in South Africa, which is a very digitally advanced country, and how it can help alleviate some of the issues we've discussed? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. And firstly, I mean, I am currently the Minister of Tourism, so I should be, telling you all about our fantastic achievements in tourism and what a wonderful country we are, and how happy we are to have you in our country. We are. But secondly, not so long ago, about a year ago, before I got this very nice job as being Minister of Tourism, I was the Minister of Science and Technology. And before that, I was once upon a time, long ago, the Minister of Agriculture. So I've sort of been through it. But in science and technology, I think South Africans who are here will tell you that, I mean, again, it's an uneven story, but generally great success stories in that area. The challenge for us, and I think my two colleagues here will tell you more about it, because they are involved in education initiatives and interventions, etc., is to take the technology that we have developed and our kind of technology capacity that we have in our country and translate it into beneficial use in education, for example. So we have a big education challenge. We've already discussed that. But how can technology be usefully applied to help us achieve our education objectives? And we're grappling with that. I would say our longer-term vision, for example, put that alongside the broadband challenge and the ICT challenge. And I think we have capacity, and we're doing an awful lot to build the infrastructure to make ourselves, let's say, a digitally advanced country, an advanced country in the area of information and communication technology. But to get that into schools, to get that into hospitals, that remains one of our challenges. Bearing in mind, of course, that a third of our population live in remote rural areas, so it's not that easy. But we have started introducing, for example, tablets or devices to assist with learning at schools. They will never replace good quality teaching at schools, but they can be a very useful tool. I've got to say this, and I'll end this. A thing that very few people know about South Africa is that we, in a small area called Astronomy, which tells you about this universe that we are part of, we are currently constructing, on the beginnings of the construction of the largest radio telescope ever constructed on this planet. It will be 50 times more powerful than any telescope that currently exists in the world, and it is probably, alongside the CERN, the biggest scientific project that the world has ever seen, between those two. And that is happening in South Africa. And we're attracting people. Often people talk about the brain drain from South Africa because there just aren't sufficient opportunities. In the world of astronomy, people are coming to South Africa because it's the place to be.
Minister, I'm cognizant of time.
Sure.
I just want to get Cas and Reuel, you through it to them, saying what are digital solutions doing for education? Quick comments, sir, and then we're going to the gentleman's
Let me use as an example what the MEC for Education in this province is doing. Okay, so he has linked electronically schools with more skills, a private school, with a public school, so that when a teacher is actually conducting a maths lesson in a private school, the teacher is simultaneously conducting that lesson to children in the public school, okay? Now that's a very simple way of electronic connectivity and optimizing the resources we have to benefit children. So that's just by way of an example in the tablets and so on. So.
I think the minister has sketched the background very, very commendably. A number of private sector initiatives are actually on the ground, unsung, as it were. Apart from trying to run a bank, I actually chair a number of NGOs. And these have actually been collaborating with the likes of Vodacom, with the likes of Hewlett-Packard, with the likes of IBM, in disseminating desktop computers as well as laptops in the rustic and rural areas. And a number of schools are replete with these kinds of facilities, with the private sector collaborating, as it were, with government, because these are done at government schools. So it is not as though the adoption of technology, the application of technology, it's not as though we're actually lagging behind. I think it's one area where, in fact, we have adopted technology to very good effect.
And Adam, in the report, it is identified as an underlying strength, the digital economy and what that can do for education in particular.
Absolutely, and I think this is an area where actually, in African terms, South Africa can be one of the, should and could be one of the more advanced areas. But of course, it doesn't help if you have broadband, it doesn't help if you have laptop, if the teachers are not, cannot use it in a proper way. So
exactly.
it all goes back to, I think, also fixing the basics in terms of teacher quality. And then I know that a lot of good initiatives are on the way in terms of both hardware and software and broadband. But again, it goes back to, we have to fix the basics, we have to address the quality of teachers, and then I think we can get, the scalable effect also in this country.
Thank you very much, sir.
Now, we've got anger on the platinum belt, on the gold sector. If you start rolling back legislation, how will you deal with the Labour backlash? And I will put my question to Mr. Khoza, if I may. You're famous for speaking out against the government, and the perception is that you got shut out afterwards. Is the lesson for other black executives that they should just keep their heads down? Thanks.
Thank you very much. All yours, Reuel.
I will protect you.
I am within hailing distance of a minister, but he's not one of the vindictive ones. I want to believe that there is much scope for robust and courageous conversations. And I want to believe that when you are shouted at by your leaders, you should not actually recoil. You should engage even further. Which has been, in fact, the case following that putative attack. I didn't attack anybody, I just made a statement about the degenerating of our moral quotient, and somebody took exception to that. I mentioned nobody by name, but I think I have since been borne out. And I want to believe that we should actually engage a lot more. Like we are engaging here, we are not agreeing like we had a heading instinct. The idea would be for the private sector, the public sector, and civil society to engage seriously in courageous conversations. And we should actually be sufficiently broad-minded to acknowledge where we go wrong, to acknowledge where we can, in fact, improve as we cooperate. And where I am concerned, I am happy to engage with my leadership in the public sector, in government. I would actually encourage those in the private sector not to be afraid, because there's nothing to be afraid of. I think when all is said and done, the private sector, civil society, government should serve one boss, and that boss should be the national interest.
That is a perfect, in fact, we'll have to use that in closing. We are unfortunately running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to keep your closing comments short and succinct. Reuel, I'm going to start with you in your corner in terms of, and I think let's go back to this leadership underpin, collaborative leadership between Labour, government, and business, and how we are going to achieve that in the short term. Not tomorrow, Minister, but in the short term.
No, thank you very much. I have to start by commending BCG for doing the research. We need to have a number of mirrors shined on us, so get to know where, in fact, we are falling short. But I think we have done a fair amount of analysis. We should collate all of that and develop a common analysis that enables us to understand our plight as a country, as a political economy. And following that, to embark on a program that will actually be monitored. People, as individuals, or even as members of institutions, tend to do a lot more that which is inspected as opposed to what is expected. We know what is expected. But when it comes to performance management, whether, it doesn't matter which ministry you're looking at, it doesn't matter who you are looking at government, when it comes to performance management, I believe we are somewhat wanting. If we could adopt something from the private sector where, unless you stack up against certain criteria, unless you perform to a certain expected level, you actually get punished or rewarded. So performance management, I believe, would be key as we go forward. Even where the NDP is concerned, there should be timelines and deadlines. Unless there are those, people don't perform to any schedule, they drift.
All about performance management. Cas.
Yeah, I just want to say I believe we're sitting here as patriotic South Africans, and it goes to the last question. As patriotic South Africans, we need to be critical, we need to be constructive in our criticism, and we need to move this country forward. So as far as I'm concerned, I think that we talk a lot in this country. I just don't think we're talking about the right issues. I don't think we're talking about the hard issues.
Except for today.
Except for today. And what we need to do is we need to, as Reuel says, put national interest on the agenda, from government through to business and civil society. And we need to understand that we're not enemies. We've got to collaborate to actually unlock the phenomenal potential that this country has.
Minister?
Well, I find myself in this very difficult position of agreeing with this capitalist on the far right over here, you know, and this banking sector leader on my right over here. I think we are speaking the same language in many respects. But I think translating these very valuable dialogue opportunities, they are very important, because we should be forever identifying the challenges, seeking solutions collectively, but translating that into kind of action is our biggest single challenge. We've got good policy thinking. Our limitations in translating basically a good policy framework into effective action is one of our biggest challenges, getting the basics right. And the basics right would be how local governments function. So if every local government in our country, for example, did what it needs to do and did it well, it would be a very different look country.
Adam.
No, I think what underpins any change, be it personal or on a national level, is first you have to recognize that there is a problem and kind of create a consensus around the burning platform. And I do think that the discussions today is evidence that I think is getting to the forefront more and more. And I also think the discussions are getting more and more honest and courageous. And so now it's more a matter of, I think we have enough analysis and enough reports. It's now a matter of just doing it, if you will. And if you look at the history of South Africa, you have a history of great leaders, and you have a history of getting things done. So we are actually fundamental, even though we have had a constructive tone today, or maybe a little pessimistic, I think we are fundamentally positive in terms of the outlook for South Africa, and so we are positive for the future.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the robust debate. We've been coming to you live from the Cape Town Convention Centre. I want to leave you with one thought on our discussion today, and that is borrowing from Reuel Khoza and his statement that business, labour, government, civil society has one boss, that is the national interest. Thank you very much for joining us.